Sawubona. That means hello in Zulu. And welcome to lesson 12 of this basic biblical Greek course. And in today's lesson, we are going to be introducing and learning the secondary endings, which are monumental when it comes to learning Greek verbs. We're also going to be looking at augments and what they are. And then I will teach you the imperfect tense form. And then finally, we'll learn some new vocabulary together and then practice that vocab doing some translation work. And I'm hoping to do at least 3 examples with you today and to even analyze the text just to help you dig deeper. So be blessed as you walk through this lesson with me. And if you didn't catch it the first time, then you have the advantage of watching it again afterwards. But let's get going. Since we are learning about a new tense form in today's lesson, I thought it'd be a good idea to do some revision of the 5 characteristics of Greek verbs. If you want a fuller explanation of each one, please go and watch lesson 2 of this basic biblical Greek course. So the first characteristic of verbs is that they have a voice. The second, they have a mood. Third, they have a person. Fourth, they have number. And finally, they have tense. So let's speak about each one briefly. The voice, if you remember, indicates the relationship of the action of a verb to its subject. And there are 3 voices in Greek. We have the active voice, where the subject performs the action. We have the middle voice, where the subject acts for itself. And finally, we have the passive voice, where the subject receives the action of the verb. The second characteristic is the mood, and the mood indicates the relationship of the action of a verb to reality. And we get 4 moods in Greek. We get the subjunctive, which expresses potential or probable action. We get the imperative mood, which you can think of simply as expressing a command for now. And then we have the optative mood, which expresses potential action in the form of a polite request, a wish, or sometimes a prayer. And then finally, we have the indicative mood. And we have been learning about the indicative mood, and we are staying with the indicative mood for a while. And remember, the indicative mood is the only mood where time is significant or relevant. Any mood outside of the indicative mood, time becomes insignificant. Then we have the person. The person indicates the actor of the verb, and the actor of the verb can be first, second, or third person. The first person is the person speaking, and it can be I or we. The second person is the person being spoken to, and normally you if it's singular, and you if it's plural. And the third person is the personal thing being spoken about. He, she, it, they. You can think of lots of examples there. The fourth characteristic is the number. The number indicates whether the actor of a verb is singular or plural. And then the final characteristic is the tense. And I'm going to reserve doing revision and speaking about the tense for a later stage in this lesson, when we actually look at the tense forms of the imperfect tense. So up until this point of the course, we have only been dealing with primary endings. So just to remind you, primary endings tell us that an action happens in the present. All right, so we only use primary endings for actions that take place in the present time. And because we've been dealing with the indicative mood and will continue using the indicative mood, I also want to remind you that we have connecting vowels, specifically omicron or epsilon, and they help us with pronunciation of the verbs. So on the right-hand side, I have given you a summary of the primary endings once again. So the singular endings, the first person, there is no actual ending, so that's why there's a dash there. The second person singular is sigma. The third person singular is iota. The first person plural is men. Second person plural is te. And third person plural is INC. And so what we have done is we've taken these primary endings and attached them to a stem. And the stem that we have been working with is lu. So let me underline the stem for you. Let me also highlight the connecting vowels. So it's either the epsilon or the omicron. All right, there we have a diphthong for the third person plural. Right, so let me remind you of the primary active endings using lu. The first person singular is luo, second person singular is luace, third person singular is lua. The first person plural is luar men, second person plural luete, and third person plural is luu sin. Let's also quickly do some revision of the primary middle passive endings. So on the right hand side is a table that gives us a summary of the primary middle passive endings. So the first person singular is my, second person singular sai, third person singular tai. The plural, first person metha, second plural isthe, and third person plural in tai. And so we follow the same structure. We take those endings and we attach them to the stem, which is lu. Once again, we have our connecting vowels, the omicron or the epsilon, and then we have the endings. All right, so as you can see, the second person singular is the only modification that has taken place. If you want to go back and remind yourself of how that change took place, then please watch lesson 3 of this course. So let's go through them very quickly. First person singular is luar mai, second person singular lua, third person singular luetai, first person plural luar metha, second person plural lu este, and then the third person plural lu ontai. All right, now that you are reminded of what the primary endings are, I want to now introduce you to the secondary endings, specifically the secondary active endings. But why do we have something called secondary endings? Well, the reason is secondary endings tell us that an action happens in the past. So whereas primary endings told us about actions that happens in the present time, secondary endings tell us about actions that happen in the past. So on the left-hand side, I've given you the primary endings again so that we can just see if there are any similarities to the secondary endings. So the primary active endings, let me just circle those for you again. We want to focus now primarily on the secondary active endings. So let's have a look at the singular first. The first person singular is a nu. Second person singular is a sigma. The third person singular, there is no ending. All right, and I've just put a little asterisk there and a number 1. Let's have a look at that detail together. It says the connecting vowel will stand alone. All right, so the connecting vowel is an epsilon, so it will stand alone by itself. Then the plural endings, the first person plural is men, second person plural is te, and the third person plural is nu. So once again, there's an asterisk there. Let's have a look at that detail together. It says it's the same as the first person singular, in brackets, must therefore be determined from the context. Right, so as you can see, the first person singular and the third person plural both have the same ending. And so those two will only be differentiated or determined by the context in which they are found. So as you can see, there are one or two similarities here between the primary active and secondary active endings. The first similarity is that both the second person singulars are sigma, and the first person and second person plurals are men and te. Right, so there's only 3 new endings to learn, and that is the first person singular, the new, the third person singular, which actually isn't an ending, so that's helpful, and then the third person plural, which is also new. So I want to encourage you to get familiar with the secondary active endings and learn them off by heart. So in the same way that we compared the primary active and secondary active endings, let us now compare the primary middle passive and secondary middle passive endings. So on the left hand side, I've given you the primary middle passive endings: my, sai, tai, metha, iste, and in tai. So let's have a look at the secondary middle passive endings together. The singular first person is main. The second person singular is sa. So there's an asterisk with a 1. Let's quickly see what that detail says. In all but a few forms, which will be learned later, this ending appears in a modified form. So either u or o. Right, so even though the true ending is sa, you will never find it like that in the Bible. You will always find it in its modified form as the u or o. And we'll learn that in more detail when we actually attach it to a stem. The third person singular is ta. The first person plural is metha. Second person plural iste. And third person plural is in ta. So once again, there are 1 or 2 similarities here between these endings, and I think the 2 that have stayed the same are the first person and second person plural. Right, so when it comes to the middle passive endings, there are 4 new ones to learn: the main, the sa, the ta, and the in ta. Once again, I want to encourage you to memorize these off by heart, as it'll be making learning the verbs a lot easier.
Secondary tenses take different endings than primary verbs. So listen up close, 'cause I'm gonna show you how to end secondary tense verbs. They all take secondary endings. New sigma nothing, it looks like n. Menten new, or sometimes son. Endings for active, man they're so attractive. Now let's try middle passive secondary endings. Main, who, or saw, and then a ta. Methystheton ta, and that is all. Endings for middle passive, also very attractive. Now let's go back to active secondary endings. Secondary endings. New sigma nothing, it looks like n. Menten new, or sometimes son. Endings for active, man they're so attractive. Now let's try middle passive secondary endings. Main, u, or saw, and then a ta. Methystheton ta, and that is all. Endings for middle passive, also very attractive. Now you surely have mastered secondary endings. Oh, secondary endings. You need to know one more thing, baby. Put an epsilon before the stem. Add these endings after a connecting vowel, and you've made imperfect indicative. Ooh, imperfect indicative.
So let's talk about augments. The imperfect tense and every other secondary tense in the indicative mood has an augment. So what is an augment? The augment is a sign of past time and occurs only in the indicative mood. Right, so this is roughly equivalent to adding the suffixes ed to the end of our English verbs. So for example, we would say John kicked the ball, the ed conveying past time. So in order to show past time in Greek, we need to have an augment present in the verb. So let's speak about how augments work. So in order to understand how augments work, we need to look at three variations. The first variation are verbs beginning with consonants. So look at these examples here with me. We have luo, balo, meno, and krino. So all these verbs begin with consonants. So the basic rule here is verbs beginning with consonants take an epsilon augment, which is then prefixed to the front of the verb. So as you can see here, all these verbs, when placed in the past tense, take an epsilon augment. So luo becomes luon, balo becomes balon, meno becomes menon, and krino becomes krinon. Also notice that the primary active ending o changes to the secondary active ending, which is the nu, with the accompanying connecting vowel, the omicron. Let's move on to the second variation, which are verbs beginning with vowels. So our examples here are agapao, egero, ago, and aiteo. All these verbs begin with vowels. So the basic rule here is that the vowel is lengthened. All right, so you would expect the alpha, the lengthened vowel, to be an alpha, but the alpha is lengthened instead to an eta. So look at agapao, also look at ago, where the alpha lengthens to an eta. The second example, egero, the lengthened vowel is an eta, so that shouldn't cause you too many problems. And then in our fourth example, we have a diphthong. So when you see a diphthong like alpha iota or epsilon iota, its normal augmented form is a lengthened vowel, the eta, with a iota subscript. And then let's take a look at our third variation, which are compound verbs. Compound verbs, again, are verbs that have a preposition attached to the front of them. And the basic rule here that governs compound verbs is that the augment occurs after the preposition. Furthermore, if the preposition ends with a vowel, that vowel usually drops out before the augment. So let's take a look at these four examples. We have ek, balo, apa, thanesco, apa, stelo, and pros, ukamai. So remember, the rule is that the augment occurs after the preposition. So ek balo changes to ex e balon. So even though the augment comes after the preposition, it's still at the front of the verb. And then the next two examples, apothenaisko and apostello, because their prepositions end in vowels, so they both have the omicron at the end, that omicron drops out and it's replaced by the augment. So apothenaisko becomes apethennaiskon, and apostello becomes apestellon. And then the last example, proseuchomai, you see there that the epsilon upsilon lengthens to an eta upsilon. So proseuchomai becomes proseuchomein. Let's begin with some revision of aspect and tense. So aspect, or specifically verbal aspect, is this. It is the subjective perspective or viewpoint from which an author communicates the action of a given verb. So aspect is very important because it is the framework that helps us to understand Greek tense. So we have 6 tense forms: the present, imperfect, aorist, perfect, pluperfect, and future tense forms. And in the indicative mood, time is significant. So the present tense form is related to the present time, the future is related to a future time, and the imperfect, aorist, perfect, and pluperfect all tells us about an action that takes place in the past. So up until this point, we have been learning about the present tense forms and the future tense forms. In today's lesson, we are now learning about the imperfect tense form, which is the first tense form where an action takes place in the past. There are 3 types of verbal aspect. The first one is the imperfective, which includes the present and imperfect tense forms. The second verbal aspect is the perfective, which includes the future and aorist tense forms. And then finally we have the stative, which involves the perfect and pluperfect tense forms. So even though we are looking at a new tense form, which is the imperfect, it's still related to the first verbal aspect, which is the imperfective. So as I ease you into the imperfect tense form, I thought it would be helpful to give you some basic background facts. So the first fact is it has the same verbal aspect as the present tense form, which is the imperfective, as I mentioned to you previously. And the imperfective verbal aspect is where action is viewed as progressive or linear or as ongoing. The second fact is some view the difference between the imperfect and the aorist, which we will learn about soon, as similar to the difference between a video and a picture. So take note of this. The imperfect is like a video in the sense that it is ongoing action in progress, whereas the aorist is like a picture, giving you a complete presentation of the event without describing how it actually unfolded. The third fact, the time of the imperfect is almost always past time due to the fact that it does not occur outside of the indicative mood. All right, so essentially the imperfect is always conveying an action in the past time. And then the fourth fact, most imperfect tense forms occur in the historical narratives, and especially in the Gospel of Mark. Okay, now that you have some basic background information to work with, let us now move on to looking at how the imperfect tense forms are made up by looking at their various components. Well, the first component is that imperfect tense form takes an augment because it indicates an action that happens in the past. And normally that augment will be an epsilon if the verb begins with a consonant. But there are a few nuances that you need to be aware of. But because our present stem is still lu and begins with a consonant, we're going to be working with the epsilon augment. And then the imperfect tense form has connecting vowels, either the omicron or the epsilon, and they are there to assist us with pronunciation. And then finally, we know that the imperfect tense form will take secondary personal endings. And I just want to give you a reminder here that contraction takes place again because it occurs in both the present and imperfect tense forms. So in lesson 9, we dealt with contraction and the various rules. And I'm sure you are glad that that lesson is over. But unfortunately, contraction comes into play again because we are dealing with the imperfect tense form. But the good news is that contraction only happens in the present and imperfect tense forms. The other tense forms do not have contraction. So let's practice now these various components using our present stem lu. So on the right hand side, I've given you the secondary active endings as a reminder. The singular are new, sigma, and then there's no actual ending for the third person singular, and the plural endings are men, te, and nu. Alright, so those are easily identifiable at the end of the imperfect active endings. So let me just underline those for you. Remember that the first person singular and the third person plural both have the same ending, and so the only way to distinguish between them is by looking at the context. Also remember that because we are dealing with secondary endings, which tells us about an action that took place in the past, we need to include the augment. Right, so that's why we have the epsilon at the front of the stem being lu once again. And then we also have our connecting vowels, the omicron or the epsilon. You'll notice there with the third person singular that the actual ending is the connecting vowel, but sometimes, depending on whether the following word begins with a vowel or a consonant, it's going to take a movable nu. Right, so let's go through the forms together. First person singular is eluon, second person singular, elus, third person singular, elue, first person plural, eluamen, second person plural, elueta, and third person plural, eluon. So the question that we have to now answer is, how do we translate the imperfect tense forms? So the imperfect tense form falls within the umbrella of the imperfective verbal aspect. And verbal aspect is the author's subjective perspective or viewpoint from which they communicate a given action. And so when the author or speaker is communicating the imperfective verbal aspect using the imperfect tense forms, you come up with quite an interesting result. So the action is one that takes place in the past, but although it takes place in the past, from their perspective, It's an action that is still ongoing, still in progress. And so I want you to simply think of it right now when it comes to translating the imperfect tense forms, is that it's a past continuous, progressive, linear kind of action. All right, so let's put some flesh and words onto this concept and see how we would actually translate the imperfect active tense forms. So we've learned our forms. The singulars are eluon, elus, and elue with the movable nu. The plural forms are eluamen, eluete, and eluon. So we're going to translate the imperfect active as a past action that is still progressive, linear, or continuous. Right, so eluon we would translate as I was loosing. So we include the helping verb was, which shows that the action took place in the past, but we translate the verb as continuous. The second person plural, you were loosing. Third person singular, he or she, it was loosing. The first person plural, eluamen, we were loosing. The second person plural, elueta, you were loosing. And then the third person plural, eluon, they were loosing. It's time now to look at the imperfect middle passive endings with lu. So I've once again given you the secondary middle passive endings to remind you what they are. The singulars are main, sa, and ta, and the plural endings are metha, iste, and nta. So let's now turn our attention to the imperfect middle passive forms. So you can see that once again we have our augment, which is an epsilon, because our stem lu begins with a consonant. And we also see there that we have connecting vowels, the omicron or the epsilon. And then we attach the secondary endings to the stem. So let's go through these forms together. The first person singular is elu main. The second person singular is elu, and I'll come back to this in a moment to explain to you why it is not sa but u now. The third person singular is elu-e-ta. The first person plural is elu-a-metha. The second person plural is elu-es-tha. You see that I've made a mistake there. Elu-es-the. All right. So you can see that I'm still learning as well. And then the third person plural is elu-an-ta. All right, so let's go back to the second person singular and understand why the sa has changed. So even though the true ending for the second person singular is sa, as you can see there in the table, what has happened? What says, however, the sigma could not stand between two vowels. So if we simply attach the sa, we would have elu asa. And according to the Greek rules, the sigma cannot stand between two vowels, which are the omicron. So it drops away, and then the two omicrons contract to form u. That is why our modified ending is elu u and not elu asa. All right, so I hope that makes sense to you.
So, a memory device for the imperfect middle passive indicative. Remember, our present middle passive indicative was oh my, a Methodist on the tie. Well, now this kid, this Johnny Cash wannabe, pushing the limits of fashion, comes in again. Now, let's imagine there's a little old lady in the church who likes to keep her eye on things. She sees him come in. She knows that kid's there. She's like, oh man, oh man. Then, before she even sees anything, she smells something. Ooh. She looks over. He's wearing sandals, or maybe has a big piece cut out on the front of his shoe and his big toe sticking out. A toe, she says. She looks closer. There is John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, painted on his toenail here in the Baptist church. A Methodist on the toe, right? So first she sees him. Oh man, that kid again. Oh man. Ooh. Ooh, ooh. He's got his toe. Ooh, a toe. A Methodist on the toe. Oh man, ooh, a toe. A Methodist on the toe. And in fact, we have a toe with the Methodist on it, just to help you drive that image into your brain.
It's now time to look at how we translate the imperfect middle passive indicative. So we'll begin with the middle and then look at the passive. So we have LUR main. The middle is I was loosing for myself, and the passive, I was being loosed. The second person singular, LU, we translate the middle voice as you were loosing for yourself, and the passive voice as you were being loosed. Third person singular, LU eta, we translate the middle voice as he was loosing for himself, and the passive voice as he was being loosed. The plural forms, the first person plural, LUR metha, with the middle voice, we translate it as we were loosing for ourselves, and the passive voice, we were being loosed. Second person plural, LUS, we translate the middle voice with you were loosing for yourselves, and the passive voice, you were being loosed. And then the third person plural, LUANTA, the middle voice, they were loosing for themselves, and with the passive voice, they were being loosed. All right, and just remember that you will have to determine from the context whether it's the middle voice or the passive voice. So in lesson 5, we learnt about a copulative or linking verb, and that was the Greek verb ийм. So let me just do some revision with us very quickly. Ийм is the most common verb in Greek. Remember that it has no voice, so when we pass it, we only pass it with tense, mood, person, and a number. Now, this kind of verb is a verb that expresses a state of being. So in some textbooks, you will see that it's known as a verb of being. And for our purposes, it's important to remember that ийм is a linking verb because it links the subject to its predicate. So a predicate is a way of giving us more information about the subject, and it can do that either as a substantive, a noun, where it would then function as the predicate nominative, but if it is describing or modifying the subject, then it could be functioning as a predicate adjective. So if you want to just refresh your memory on the predicate, then please go and watch lesson 5 again. And some English examples of linking verbs include is, are, was, were, etc. So let's revise the present indicative forms of ийм. The singular forms, first person is ийм, second person a, third person esten with the movable nu. The plural forms, first person esmen, second person este, third person esin, also with a movable nu. And then regarding their translation, the first person singular, ийм, we translate as I am. second person singular a as you are, and the third person singular estin as he, she, it is. And then the plural forms, first person es men, we translate as we are, second person plural este as you are, and the third person plural asin as they are. So let me just say those forms for you one more time. We have eimi, a, estin, the plural forms es men, este, and asin. And now let me teach you the imperfect indicative of eimi. So on the left hand side, I've given you the present forms just to see if there are any similarities or differences between them and the imperfect. So as you can see, they are very different. And so the imperfect forms are going to seem very foreign to you initially. But if you just go over them regularly and practice them, you should have them down in no time. So this is the singular forms together. The first person is a main. Second person singular is a. Third person singular is ein. The plural forms, first person, a men. Second person, a te. And third person, a son. And how would we translate each one of them? A main we would translate as I was. Second person singular a we translate as you were. Third person singular ein as he, she, it was. And then a men we translate as we were. A te we translate as you were. And a son we translate as they were. Alright, so all those linking verbs indicating a past imperfective verbal aspect. Alright, it's time for our vocabulary for this lesson. And before we go through the words, I just want to exhort you and plead with you to take the time to go through your vocab and to learn each word. As you can see, the more translation work we are doing, it becomes very difficult to translate and even just read the Greek New Testament if you don't know your vocab. So it really is worth memorizing and knowing the words. So let's go through today's vocab. The first word is I row, which means I take up. Next we have apokteno, which means I kill. Then we have heos, with a rough breathing mark, and that means until. And it's normally these little words that are going to cause you the most problems. They still cause me the most problems. And next we have thelema, thelematos ta. Alright, so I hope that you can recognize what type of a noun that is. It is a third declension because it gives us the nominative and genitive singular forms. The genitive is very helpful because then we know what the stem ends with, and it ends with a tau, which is a consonant, and that means I will. Then we have lepo, which is a verb, means I leave. Right, then we have a preposition, meta, which can mean with if its object is in the genitive case, and after if the object is in the accusative case. Then we have holos, hole, holon, right, which is an adjective giving us the masculine, feminine, and neuter genders, and this means whole. Then we have horao, with a rough breathing mark, and that means I see. Then we have ude, and every time you see an u in a word, that tells you that it's some form of a negative idea, and as you can see there, it means and not even. And then we have this construction, ude, ellipsis, and then ude, and that is translated as neither nor. Then we have huto with a rough breathing mark, huto, and that means thus or so. Next we have palin, palin, which means again. Next we have pus pados ha, which means foot. Then we have tote, tote, which means then. And finally we have hupe, hupe, which can mean on behalf of with a genitive and above with its object in the accusative case. All right, so not a lot of vocab for today's lesson, but certainly not easy because some of these little words can be very difficult. So please take the time to learn them well. Let's read our first example together. The Greek text says, eblepen ha basalus tutu tu kosmu tus hagius hate apathaneskon. So our first word, eblepen, is a verb. It's an imperfect tense form, active voice, indicative mood, third person singular, and the vocab, it means see. The next word, ha, is an article. It's a nominative masculine singular, which we simply could translate as the. Then we have basalus, which is a noun, nominative masculine singular, and it means king. Then we have tutu, which is a demonstrative pronoun. It's a genitive case, masculine gender, singular, and it means this. Then we have tu, which is also an article, genitive masculine singular, means the. Then we have kosmu, which is a noun, genitive masculine singular, and it means world. Then we have tus, which is an article, accusative masculine singular, also means the. Next we have hagius, which is an adjective. It's accusative masculine singular, translated as holy. And then we have hate, which is an adverb, and that means when. And finally we have apathaneskon, which is also a verb. It is imperfect, active, indicative. All right. It can be first or third person, singular or plural, and it'll need to be determined from the context, and it means die. So let's translate this verse into the English using this passing sheet in our next slide. So based on the information in our passing sheet, we could put this English translation together. The king of this world was seeing the holy men when they were dying. So let's make some observations here. Let's take a look at the two verbs in this text. All right, the first one is eblepen, and the second one is apathaneskon. So as you can see, both of these verbs are imperfect tense forms. And how do we know that? Well, the first one, eblepen, because it's a verb that begins with a consonant, it takes its augment as an epsilon. And then we see there we have our third person singular ending, all right, which is simply the connecting vowel, the epsilon, and the movable nu there is attached because the following word is a vowel. So eblepen, we translate that as was seeing, communicating the imperfective verbal aspect. And then our second verb, we have apathaneskon. So there we see a compound verb construction. And we have the preposition at the front, which is normally apa. And so the final vowel has dropped away, and we are left with the augment, the epsilon, which comes after the preposition but in front of the verb, showing that it's imperfective tense form. And then I said to you, this can be a first person or a third person, depending on the context. All right, so based on the context, this final ending is a third person plural. So that's why we translate it as they were dying. And the final observation that I'd like to make is regarding the adjective, hagios. Remember, when you see an adjective, it can function in three ways. It can function attributively, it can function as a predicate, or it can function as a substantive. All right, so in this verse, it's functioning as a substantive. It's functioning as a noun. And because it's masculine plural, then we supply the English words holy men. All right, so men based on the fact that it is a masculine gender. Let's take a look at our second example for this lesson. The Greek text reads, ekenoi hoi, mathetai, akuon, phonein, hupe, autus, u, de, eblepon, anthropon. So, ekenoi is a demonstrative pronoun, nominative, masculine, plural. We translate it therefore as those. Then we have hoi, an article, nominative, masculine, plural. Next we have mathetai, which is a noun, nominative, masculine, plural. The vocab is disciple. Then we have akuon, which is a verb, imperfect, active, indicative. Third person, it can be a first person, but the context tells us that it's a third person plural, which means here. Then we have phonein, which is a noun, accusative, feminine, singular, and it can be translated as voice or sound. Then we have hupe, which is a preposition, and it takes its object here in the accusative case. That's why we translate it as above. Then we have autus, which is our third person personal pronoun. It's accusative, masculine, singular, which we translate as them. Then we have u, which is a negative particle, which can mean no or not. Then we have de, which is a conjunction, translated as but. Then we have eblepon, which is a verb, imperfect tense form, active, indicative, also third person plural, which means see. And finally we have anthropon, which is a noun, accusative, masculine, singular. The vocab is man. So let's do our translation together. So based on our passing sheet, we can put this translation together. Those disciples were hearing a voice above them, but they were not seeing a man. Let's make some observations here. We see here that our subject is hoi mathetai. All right, so this is a masculine first declension noun. It's masculine because the article is masculine, but it is a first declension because the ending is feminine. All right, but we translate that as the disciples, but because we have a demonstrative pronoun, it's pointing out that it's not just any disciples, it's those disciples. And then we have two verbs in this text. The first one is akuon, and this comes from the lexical form aku, o. All right, so you can see there that the initial vowel has lengthened to an eta, all right, showing us that this is an imperfect tense. So we translate that as the disciples were hearing. And then our second verb is eblepon. And there is a verb that begins with a consonant. So it simply takes an epsilon augment. It's a third person plural. So we translate it as they were. And then we have the the negative particle u, so it's they were not seeing. And then as you can see, both of these verbs take a direct object. A ku-on has its object as phonein, which is a voice, and iblepon also has its direct object, and that is anthropon, which is a man. Right, so both those verbs are transitive verbs that require a direct object. Let's read our third translation example together. So the Greek text says, Hi epangelii tu patros haimon ason agathai hoti ason tu theu. So very quickly, hi is an article, nominative, feminine, plural. Then we have apangelii, which is a noun, also nominative, feminine, plural, vocab, it's promise. Then we have tu, which is also an article, it's genitive, masculine, singular. Then we have patros, which is a noun, genitive, masculine, singular, which means father. Then we have haimon, which is a personal pronoun. Because it's first person, it doesn't have a gender. It's plural and translated as our. Then we have two copulative verbs here, ason and ason, so we'll do these together. They are imperfect tense, all right, so they don't have voices. They're indicative, third person plural, translate as they were. All right, then we have agathai, which is an adjective, nominative, feminine, plural, means good. Then we have hoti, which is a conjunction, means because. Then we have tu, which is an article, and finally theu, which is a noun, genitive, masculine, singular, meaning God. All right, so let's do our translation together. So our English translation is, the promises of our Father were good because they were of God. All right, so we see a hi epangelii, and we can include there tu patros haimon, which is the promises of our Father as being the subject of this verse. And then we have two copulative verbs, ason, which we translate with the imperfect tense form. So we use were to convey the past time. And then we have agathai, which is a adjective, all right, and it's in the nominative case. So we translate it as good, but its function is a predicate adjective. Why is it a predicate adjective? Because it is modifying the subject. It is telling us more about the promises of our Father. They are good. And then it carries on, because they were of God. And then we have this second implied subject here, they, which is actually built within the second copulative verb, and they refers back to the promises of our Father.